The passage of the army. The entry of Great Britain into war with the most powerful military empire which has ever existed was strategically impressive. Her large fleets vanished into the mists at one end of the island. Her small army hurried out of the country at the other. By this double gesture, she might seem to uninstructed eyes to divest herself of all her means of defence, and to expose her coast nakedly to the hostile thrust. Yet these two movements, dictated by the truest strategy, secured at once our own safety and the salvation of our allies. The Grand Fleet gained the station whence the control of the seas could be irresistibly asserted. The regular army reached in the nick of time the vital post on the flank of the French line. Had all our action been upon this level, we should today be living in an easier world. The Great War Council, 5th of August. The differences which had prevailed about entering the war were aggravated by a strong cross-current of opinion, by no means operative only in the cabinet, that if we participated, it should be by naval action alone. Men of great power and influence, who throughout the struggle laboured tirelessly and rendered undoubted services, were found at this time resolutely opposed to the landing of a single soldier on the continent. And if everything had not been prepared, if the plan had not been perfected, if it had not been the only plan, and if all military opinion had not been industriously marshalled around it, who shall say what fatal hesitancy might not have intervened? On the afternoon of the 5th of August, the Prime Minister convened an extraordinary council of war at Downing Street. I do not remember any gathering like it. It consisted of the ministers most prominently associated with the policy of our entering the war, the chiefs of the Navy and the Army, all the high military commanders, and in addition Lord Kitner and Lord Roberts. Decision was required upon the question, how should we wage the war that had just begun? Those who spoke for the War Office knew their own minds and were united. The whole British Army should be sent at once to France, according to what may justly be called the Haldane Plan. Everything in that minister's 8 years' tenure of the War Office had led up to this, and had been sacrificed for this. To place an army of 4 or 6 divisions of infantry, thoroughly equipped with their necessary cavalry on the left of the French line within 12 or 14 days of the order of mobilisation, and to guard the home island meanwhile by the 14 territorial divisions he had organised, was the scheme upon which, aided by Field Marshals Nicholson and French, he had concentrated all his efforts and his stinted resources. It was a simple plan, but it was a practical plan. It had been persistently pursued and laboriously and minutely studied. It represented approximately the maximum war effort that the voluntary system would yield, applied in the most effective and daring manner to the decisive spot. And mobilisation schemes, railway graphics, timetables, the organisation of bases, depots, supply arrangements, filling many volumes, regulated and ensured a thorough and concerted execution. A commander whose whole life led up to this point had been chosen. All that remained to be done was to take the decision and give the signal. At this point, I reported on behalf of the Admiralty that our mobilisation being in every respect complete, and all our ships in their war stations, we would waive the claim we had hitherto made in all the discussions of the Committee of Imperial Defence, that 2 regular divisions should be retained in Great Britain as a safeguard against invasion, and that so far as the Admiralty was concerned, not 4 but the whole 6 divisions could go at once, that we would provide for their transportation and for the security of the island in their absence. This considerable undertaking was made good by the Royal Navy. Discussion then turned upon the place to which they should be dispatched. Lord Roberts inquired whether it was not possible to base the British Army on Antwerp so as to strike, in conjunction with the Belgian armies, at the flank and rear of the invading German hosts. We were not able from the Admiralty point of view to guarantee the sea communications of so large a force on the enemy side of the Straits of Dover, but only inside the Anglo-French flotilla cordon, which had already taken up its station. Moreover, no plans had been worked out by the War Office for such a contingency. They had concentrated all their thought upon integral cooperation with the French left, wherever it might be. It was that, or nothing. Another discussion took place upon how far forward the British Expeditionary Force should be concentrated. Some high authorities dwelling on the fact that the mobilisation of the British Army had begun 3 days later than the French, were for concentrating it around Amiens, for intervention after the first shock of battle had been taken. But in the end, Sir John French and the Forward School had their way, and it was felt that we must help France in the way the French staff thought would be the most effective. Changes in the Cabinet. When I next went to the Cabinet after the declaration of war, I found myself with new companions. During the previous 7 years, Lord Morley had always sat on the left of the Prime Minister, and I had always sat next to Lord Morley. Many a wise and witty admonition had I received, pencilled in scholarly phrase, from my veteran neighbour, and many a charming courtesy, such as he has excelled in, had graced a toilsome path of business. He had said to me on the Sunday of resolve, "If it has to be, I am not the man to do it. I should only hamper those like you who have to bear the burden." Now he was gone. In his place sat Lord Kitchener. On my left there was also a fresh figure, the new Minister of Agriculture, Lord Lucas. I had known him since South African war days, when he lost his leg, and to know him was to delight in him. His open, gay, responsive nature, his witty, ironical, but never unchivalrous tongue, his pleasing presence, his compulsive smile, made him much courted by his friends, of whom he had many, of whom I was one. Young for the Cabinet, heir to splendid possessions, happy in all that surrounded him, he seemed to have captivated fortune with the rest. Both these two men were marked for death at the hands of the enemy, the young minister grappling with his adversary in the high air, the old field marshal choking in the icy sea. I wonder what the 20 politicians round the table would have felt if they had been told that the prosaic British cabinet was itself to be decimated in the war they had just declared. I think they would have felt a sense of pride and of relief in sharing to some extent the perils to which they were to send their countrymen, their friends, their sons. Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War. At the Council of War on the 5th of August, Lord Kitchener had not yet become Secretary of State for War, but I knew that his appointment was impending. The Prime Minister, then also Secretary of State for War, could not possibly be burdened with a continuous flow of interdepartmental work proceeding between the War Office and the Admiralty, and requiring to be transacted between ministers. He therefore invited Lord Kitchener to undertake ministerial charge of the War Office, and the Field Marshal, who had certainly not sought this post in any way, had no choice but to accept. My relations with Lord Kitchener had been limited. Our first meeting had been on the field of Omdurman, when as a lieutenant in the 21st Lancers, I had been sent back to report verbally to the Commander-in-Chief the position of the advancing Dervish army. He had disapproved of me severely in my youth, had endeavoured to prevent me from coming on the Sudan campaign, and was indignant that I succeeded in getting there. It was a case of dislike before first sight. On my side, I had dealt with his character and campaigns in 2 bulky volumes, conceived throughout in a faithful spirit of critical impartiality. It was 12 years before I saw him again, when we were formally introduced to each other, and had a brief talk at the army manoeuvres in 1910. I got to know him a little at the Malta Conference in 1912, and thenceforward we used to talk over imperial defence topics when from time to time we met. On these occasions I had found him much more affable than I had been led to expect from my early impressions, or from all I had heard about him. In the week before the war he had lunched and dined together 2 or 3 times, and we had discussed all the possibilities so far as we could foresee them. I was glad when he was appointed Secretary of State for War, and in those early days we worked together on close and cordial terms. He consulted me constantly on the political aspects of his work, and increasingly gave me his confidence in military matters. Admiralty and War Office business were so interlaced that during the whole of the first 10 months, we were in almost daily personal consultation. I cannot forget that when I left the Admiralty in May 1915, the first, and with one exception the only one of my colleagues who paid me a visit of ceremony, was the overburdened Titan, whose disappropriation had been one of the disconcerting experiences of my youth. Organisation of the British Armies. As is well known, the British armies on mobilisation consisted of a highly organised expeditionary force of 6 regular divisions of infantry and a cavalry division. In addition, there were 2 regular infantry divisions, the 7th and 8th, which had to be collected from their garrisons all over the Empire, or formed out of troops surplus to the expeditionary force at home. And it was decided also to employ 2 divisions, half British and half native, from India. Behind these trained forces, unquestionably of a very high order, stood 14 territorial divisions and 13 mounted brigades, to whom the defence of Britain must be confided. These were little trained, lightly equipped with artillery, but composed of far-sighted and intelligent men, who had not waited for the hour of danger to make their country's cause their own. In 6 months, or as some thought in a shorter period, such troops could be made to play their part. Lord Kitchener now came forward to the Cabinet, on almost the first occasion after he joined us, and in soldierly sentences proclaimed a series of inspiring and prophetic truths. Everyone expected that the war would be short, but wars took unexpected courses, and we must now prepare for a long struggle. Such a conflict could not be ended on the sea or by sea power alone. It could be ended only by great battles on the continent. In these, the British Empire must bear its part on a scale proportionate to its magnitude and power. We must be prepared to put armies of millions in the field and maintain them for several years. In no other way could we discharge our duty to our allies or to the world. These words were received by the Cabinet in silent assent, and it is my belief that had Lord Kitchener proceeded to demand universal national service to be applied as it might be required, his request would have been acceded to. He, however, proposed to content himself with calling for volunteers, and in the first instance to form 6 new regular divisions. It would have been far better to have formed the new volunteers upon the cadre of the territorial army, each of which could have been duplicated or quadruplicated in successive stages. But the new Secretary of State had little knowledge of and no faith in the British territorial system. The name itself was to him a stumbling block. In the War of 1870, he had been present at a battle on the Loire, probably Le Mans, in which the key of the position, confided to French territorial troops, had been cast away, entailing the defeat of the whole army. He dwelt on this incident to me on several occasions, and I know it had created fixed impressions in his mind. Vain to explain how entirely different were the characters of the troops forming the French and British territorial forces, the former aged conscripts in their last periods of service, the latter keen and ardent youths of strong military predilections. They were territorials, and that was the end of it. Lord Kitchener's task. This at the very outset aggravated the difficulties of his already gigantic task. He set himself to create the cadre, first of 6, then of 12, and ultimately of 24 Kitchener Army divisions, at the same time that the recruits were pouring in upon him by the 100,000. That this vast feat of improvisation was accomplished must certainly rank among the wonders of the time. The arguments against compulsory service, cogent as they no doubt were soon reinforced by the double event of overwhelming numbers of volunteers and of a total lack of arms and equipment. Apart from the exiguous stores held by the regular army, there was literally nothing. The small scale of the military forces had led to equally small factories for war material. There were no spare rifles, there were no extra guns, and the modest supply of shells and ammunition began immediately to flash away with what seemed appalling rapidity. Many months must elapse, even if the best measures were taken, before new sources of supply, even on a moderate scale, could be opened up. One was now to learn for the first time that it took longer to make a rifle than a gun, and the rifles were the cruelest need of all. We had nothing but staves to put in the hands of the eager men who thronged the recruiting stations. I ransacked the fleet and the Admiralty stores and scraped together another 30,000 rifles, which literally meant another 30,000 men in the field. Afloat, only the Marines would have their rifles. Jack must, in the last resort, trust to his cutlass of old. The Royal Naval Division. At the moment when Lord Kitchener began the formation of his first 6 new army divisions, and before the great rush of recruits had begun, I had offered him the Royal Naval Division, which he gladly accepted. Before the war, we had foreseen the fact that the Navy would on mobilisation have many thousands of men in their depots, for whom there would be no room in any ship of war that we could send to sea. I had therefore proposed to the Committee of Imperial Defence in 1913 the formation of 3 brigades, one composed of Marines and the other 2 of men of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and of the Royal Fleet Reserve. These brigades it was intended to use to assist in home defence in the early stages of a war. The cadre were therefore easily formed from the available resources. The Marine Brigade was already virtually in existence, and it was clear that all 3 would be ready for action long before any of the new troops that were being raised. The naval volunteers who longed to serve afloat accepted the new task with many heartburnings, but with boundless loyalty. Alas, for most of them it proved a fateful decision. Few there were of that gallant company that survived unscathed. As for their deeds, they will not be forgotten in the history, even of these crowded times. Departure of the German and Austrian ambassadors. It fell to my lot to prescribe the arrangements for the departure of the German ambassador, and 8 days later of his Austrian colleague. Accordingly, on the morning of the 5th of August, I sent my naval secretary, Admiral Hood, in uniform to the German embassy, desiring to know in what manner he might facilitate Prince Lichnowsky's wishes and convenience. While the German mob were insulting and even pelting the departing French and British ambassadors, we set ourselves to work with meticulous care to secure the observance of every propriety and courtesy towards those for whom we were responsible. Prince Lichnowsky had his own record of his ceremonious treatment, which appeared to make a marked impression upon his mind. To Count Mensdorff, the Austrian ambassador, I wrote as follows. August 13th, 1914. My Naval Secretary, Admiral Hood, who brings this letter, is instructed to put himself at your disposal in arranging for the comfort and convenience of your journey by sea. If there is any way in which I can be of service to you at this time, you will not, I hope, fail to command me. Although the terrible march of events has swept aside the ancient friendship between our countries, the respect and regard which spring from so many years of personal association cannot pass from the hearts of your English friends. The Austrian ambassador asked that a ship might be provided to take him direct to Trieste, and that consideration might be shown to a number of unhappy Austrian non-combatants, long resident in London, who now had to fly the country. I therefore arranged that upwards of 200 persons should embark in the ambassador's ship. I felt sure that in taking these measures I was acting in accord with what British dignity required. Responsibilities of the First Lord. By the letters patent and orders in council constituting his office, the First Lord is responsible to Crown and Parliament for all the business of the Admiralty. In virtue of this, he delegates to an eminent sailor the responsibility for its technical and professional conduct. But he cannot thus relieve himself either in theory or in fact. He is held strictly accountable for all that takes place. For every disaster, he must bear the blame. The credit of victories rightly goes to the commanders who gain them. The burden of defeat or miscarriage must be shouldered by the Admiralty, and the censures of the nation fall primarily upon the head. How then is a civilian minister appointed for political or parliamentary reasons, and devoid of authoritative expert knowledge to acquit himself of this duty. Clearly it depends upon the character, temperament, and capacity both of the First Lord and the First Sea Lord. They must settle it between themselves, and if they cannot agree wholeheartedly on the momentous problems with which they are confronted in swift succession, another combination must be chosen by the Sovereign on the advice of the Prime Minister. I interpreted my duty in the following way. I accepted full responsibility for bringing about successful results, and in that spirit I exercised a close general supervision over everything that I had done or proposed. Further, I claimed and exercised an unlimited power of suggestion and initiative over the whole field, subject only to the approval and agreement of the First Sea Lord, on all operative orders. Right or wrong, that is what I did, and it is on that basis that I wish to be judged. In practice, the difficulties were less than would be imagined. Indeed, over long periods of unending crisis and tension, the machine worked very smoothly. The German method. On the outbreak of war, the Naval Secretary of State von Tirpitz, himself an admiral, found himself cut off entirely from the strategical and quasi-tactical control of the fleets, to such an extent that he declares he did not know the naval war plans. He was confined to purely administrative business, and thus charged, he was carried off as an adjunct to the Emperor's suite at Great Headquarters. The naval staff, headed in the first instance by von Pohl, alone had the ear of the Emperor, and received from the lips of the All-Highest indications of his imperial pleasure. The position of Admiral von Tirpitz was therefore most unhappy. The naval staff warded him off the Emperor as much as possible, and persuaded the Emperor to repulse his efforts to break in. The Emperor, oppressed with the whole burden of the state, gave to the staff from time to time directions and uttered passing expressions which thereafter operated with irresistible authority. It is to this state of affairs that Admiral von Tirpitz ascribes the paralysis which gripped the German fleet through the first critical months of the naval war. This it was, according to him, that lost the opportunity of fighting the supreme battle under the least unfavourable conditions, enabled the control of the seas to pass into our hands practically without a struggle, and secured the uninterrupted transport of our armies to the continent. If our solution of the difficult problem of naval war direction was imperfect, so also was that of our enemy. Relative naval strength. Our known margin of superiority in home waters than that at any subsequent moment in the war. The Grand Fleet is concentrated in its northern war station on August 1, 1914, comprised 24 vessels classified as dreadnoughts or better. In addition, the battle cruiser Invincible was at Queenstown watching the Atlantic. The 2 Lord Nelsons were with the Channel Fleet, and 3 battle cruisers were in the Mediterranean. The Germans actually mobilised 16 ships similarly classed. We could not be absolutely certain, though we thought it unlikely, that they might not have ready 2 or even 3 more, and these of the greatest power. Happily, every British ship was ready and in perfect order. None was under repair. Our strength for an immediate fleet action was 24 to a certain 16 and a possible 19. These figures do not, as the tables in the appendix reveal, do justice to the full material strength of the British fleets as a whole, still less to the gun power of the British line of battle, which after the dreadnoughts comprised 8 King Edwards, markedly superior to the next 8 Germans. But apart from all that may be said on this, and of the confidence which it inspired, the fact remains that from 5 to 8 dreadnoughts was all the certain numerical superiority we had. There was not much margin here for mischance, nor for the percentage of mechanical defects which in so large a fleet had to be expected, and no margin whatever for a disaster occasioned by surprise, had we been unready. To a superficial observer, who from the cliffs of Dover or Portland had looked down upon a battle squadron of 6 or 7 ships, lying in distant miniature below, the foundation upon which the British world floated would have presented itself in a painfully definitive form. If the intelligence and courage of British seamen were not all that we believed them to be, if the workmanship which had built these great vessels were not honest and thorough, if our seamanship or our gunnery had turned out to be inferior, if some ghastly novelty of blunder supervened, the battle might be very even. It is easy to understand how tense were the British naval expectations. If the German Navy was ever to fight a battle, now at the beginning was its best chance. The German Admiralty knew, of course, what ships we had available, and that we were mobilised, concentrated, and at sea. Even if they assumed the extraordinary fact that every one of our dreadnoughts was ready, and not one of them had developed a defect, they could fight to Germanise a battle 16 against a maximum 27. Heavy odds from their point of view. Still heavier when the survey was extended to the whole of the fleets. But yet odds far less heavy than they would have to face after 6 months, after 12 months, or at any later period. For look at the reinforcements which were approaching these two opposing fleets. They must assume that, in addition to completing our own vessels, we should requisition every battleship building for a foreign power in our yards. And on this basis, 7 great ships must join the Grand Fleet within 3 months, and 12 great ships within 6 months, against which only 3 in 3 months and 5 in 6 months could be reckoned on their side, leaving the balance in 3 months at 34 to 19, and in 6 months at 39 to 21. And this took no account of 3 battle cruisers in the Mediterranean, and 1, the Australia, in the Pacific, which obviously we could bring home if necessary. Prospects of battle. Here then was the least unfavourable moment for Germany. Here was the best chance they would ever see. Was it not also the strategic moment? Might they not assume that the transportation of the British army to France would be a grave preoccupation for the Admiralty? Was it not that clear that a victory, even a partial victory, would be more fruitful at this juncture than at any other? 42 fast German merchant cruisers need only a breathing space to get loose and to arm upon the seas, requiring afterwards to be hunted down one by one. Might not above all the interruption and delay in the transportation of the army be of real effect in the supreme trial of strength on land? The German staff believed in a short war. They were staking everything upon a supreme trial of strength on land. Why should not the German fleet be hurled in two and play its part for what it was worth in the supreme decision? To what other equal use could it ever be put? We therefore looked for open battle on the sea. We expected it, and we courted it. The news that the two navies were approaching each other to take a decision in blue water would have been received in the fleet with unaffected satisfaction, and at the Admiralty with composure. We could not send our grand fleet into the minefields and submarine-infested areas of the Heligoland Bight, but had battle been offered by the enemy under any conditions which did not put us at a serious disadvantage, it would have been at once accepted. In fact, however, the sober confidence of the Admiralty was based upon calculations of relative naval strength, the soundness of which was not disputed by the German naval staff. Even von Tirpitz, the advocate of action, writes, "Against an immediate fight was the fact that the whole English fleet was ready for battle when the war broke out, owing to the test mobilisation, whereas only our active squadrons were ready." Great Britain, says the official German Navy history, had secured extensive military advantages by her test mobilisation and her subsequent measures, regardless of the uneasiness necessarily provoked thereby, which advantage Germany could not counter or overtake. The German staff felt that even this was the best chance for a trial of strength. It was still a chance so hazardous and even so forlorn that it was not worth taking, and their battle fleet remained hoarded up in harbour for an ignominious day, imposing upon the British, no doubt, a continued and serious expenditure of our resources for naval purposes, gaining for Germany substantial advantages of a secondary character, but not exercising any decisive influence upon the whole course of the war. British Command of the Sea. So we waited, and nothing happened. No great event immediately occurred. No battle was fought. The Grand Fleet remained at sea. The German fleet did not quit the shelter of its harbours. There were no cruiser actions. A German mine layer sowing a minefield off Harwich was chased and sunk by a flotilla of destroyers, led by the Amphion, and the Amphion returning was blown up on the German minefield. Otherwise, silence unbroken by cannon brooded over the broad and narrow waters. But during that silence, and from its first moment, the sea power of Great Britain ruled unchallenged throughout the world. Every German cruiser in foreign waters vanished into the immense spaces of the sea. Every German merchant ship, from the earliest moment when the entry of Britain into the war became apparent, fled for neutral harbours. 7 out of 8 potential commerce destroyers were bottled up without even a shot being fired. German seaborne trade outside the Baltic ceased to exist from the night of the 4th of August. On the other hand, after a few days of hesitation, the swarming mercantile marine of Britain, encouraged by the government insurance of no more than 6%, began to put to sea. And even before the main armies had met in the battle on the continent, the whole vast ocean traffic of the British Empire was proceeding with the utmost activity. By the end of August, the rate of insurance had already fallen to 3%, and the Admiralty was able to announce that of the 42 German liners from whom attacks on trade were to be apprehended, 11 were tied up unarmed in harbours of the United States, watched outside territorial limits by British cruisers. 6 had taken refuge in other neutral harbours, where they were either dismantled or observed. 14 were in German ports, gripped by the blockade. 6 were held as prizes in British hands, and only 5 remained unaccounted for and unlocated. The fate of these 5 will be recounted later. None of these gloomy prophecies, which had formed the staple of so many debates and articles, that our merchant ships would be hunted from the seas by German raiders, that scores of additional British cruisers would be required for commerce protection, that British merchant ships, once safe in harbour, would not venture to sea materialised, and they might be relegated to the limbo of exploded alarms. The 3 great naval dangers which had bulked most largely in our minds in the years before the war. First, the danger of surprise of the fleet. Second, the mine danger. Third, the paralysis of our seaborne trade, rolled away behind us like giant waves when a ship had finally surmounted. More than 100 years had passed since the British Navy had been called upon to face an emergency of the first magnitude. If 100 years hence, in similar circumstances, it is found equally ready, we shall have no more reason to complain of our descendants than they will find in the history of this convulsion reason to complain to us. The Gerbon at Messina on the 5th of August. It is time to return to the Mediterranean. Admiral Suchet, the German commander, having outdistanced our shadowing cruisers in the darkness of the night, pursued his course to Messina, where he arrived with the Gerbon and Breslau on the morning of the 5th of August. He had already received, as we now know, a telegram sent from Naun at 1:35 a.m. on the preceding day by the German Admiralty. This message gave him all important information. It stated that an alliance had been concluded between Germany and Turkey, and directed him to proceed to Constantinople immediately. Of this treaty we knew nothing. All our reports were of an entirely different tenor. Nor was it till long afterwards that we learnt the true attitude of Turkey at this hour. On arrival at Messina, the Gerbon and Breslau began to coal from German colliers. This occupied the whole of the day, and whole of the night, and the greater part of the next day, the 6th. Exactly 36 hours elapsed before the Gerbon moved. Meanwhile, the light cruiser Gloucester, watching off the southern exit of the Straits of Messina, reported on the 5th of August to Sir Berkeley Milne that the strength of the wireless signals she was taking in indicated that the Gerbon must be at Messina. The British Commander-in-Chief had left the Malta Channel in his flagship, the Inflexible, after midnight on the 4th of August, and on the 5th he had assembled all his 3 battle cruisers and 2 light cruisers off Pantellaria Island, midway between Sicily and the African coast. According to his own published account, he had learned on the 4th that the German mail steamer General was remaining at Messina at the disposition of the Gerbon. He therefore believed throughout the whole of the 5th that the Gerbon, Breslau and General were all at Messina. His belief was correct. Sir Berkeley Milne's orders to Indomitable. One of his battle cruisers, the Indomitable, had to coal. He sent her to Bizerta. This was an important decision. Considering that he believed that the Gerbon was at Messina, and that he intended himself to watch to the northward with 2 battle cruisers, some authorities have held that it would have been a sensible precaution to let his 3rd ship coal at Malta, where facilities were certain and instant, and whence she could so easily move to close the southern exit from Messina, or join Rear Admiral Trowbridge in the mouth of the Adriatic, as that officer had been led to expect. By sending the Indomitable to coal at Malta, he could have placed 2 battle cruisers watching the northern exit and 1 at the southern. But the Commander-in-Chief decided to keep all 3 battle cruisers together in his own hand and to patrol off the western end of Sicily between Sardinia and Bizerta. The southern exit was therefore left completely open to the Gerbon, and a severe action was reserved for Rear Admiral Trowbridge if, as seemed likely, she ran up the Adriatic. At 5 p.m. on the 5th, Sir Berkeley Milne received a signal sent by the Gloucester, reporting the presence of the Gerbon at Messina. Here was certain confirmation of his belief. He was at this moment about 100 miles west of Sicily. He continued, however, to cruise with his 2 ships between Sicily and Sardinia, and as late as the evening of the 6th of August, his orders to the Indomitable were still to join him thereabouts. He did this because he considered that placing all 3 battle cruisers in this position was his surest way of carrying out the instructions of the Admiralty telegram of the 30th of July about aiding the French in the transport of their African army. That it was one method of carrying out these orders cannot be disputed, and that the Admiral had set out in his book the reasons which led him to adopt it. The superior speed of the Gerbon made it necessary, he states, if he were to intercept her, that he should stand a long way off and have timely notice of her approach. To place his whole force in this way between her and the French transports was, he argues, the best chance of catching the Gerbon if she had tried to attack them. He reported his intended dispositions late on the 4th to the Admiralty, whose only comment upon them was, "Watch over the Adriatic should be maintained for the double purpose of preventing the Austrians from coming out or the Germans from entering." The exceedingly prompt manner in which the Gerbon had been found, although in the open sea, had given the Admiralty the feeling that the Admiralty on the spot had a grip of the situation and needed no further directions. No contact with the French. Sir Berkeley Milne had not, however, succeeded in communicating with the French admiral, although he had made repeated attempts by wireless and had sent the Dublin to Bizerta with a letter. He did not know where the French fleet or the French transports were. He did not tell the Admiralty this. The Admiralty, for their part, after the general telegram of the 4th of August, enjoining immediate consultation with the French, assumed that the 2 commanders-in-chief in the Mediterranean were acting in concert. They did not therefore ask the French for any information, nor was any volunteered by the French Admiralty. Any inquiry addressed to Paris would have elicited the fact that the French had changed their plans and that no transports were yet at sea. All parties were on this point, to some extent, in fault. Meanwhile, the British ambassador in Rome was endeavouring to tell the Admiralty, as soon as the pressure on the wires allowed, that the Gerbon was at Messina. The news did not reach London till 6 o'clock on the 5th of August. The Admiralty passed it without comment, though with some delay to Sir Berkeley Milne, who already knew from other sources. It is a fair criticism on the Admiralty that they did not immediately they knew the Gerbon was at Messina authorise the British ships to follow her into the Straits. The point was not put to me either by the First Sea Lord or the Chief of the Staff, and as I had not myself been concerned in initiating or drafting the telegram about rigidly respecting Italian neutrality, it was not specially in my mind. Had it been put to me, I should at once have consented. This was no petty incident, and the prize was well worth the risk of vexing the Italians. In fact, permission to chase through the straits was given by the Admiralty, unasked, to Sir Berkeley Milne, as soon as it was realised that the Gerbon was escaping unblocked to the southward. It was then too late. Gerbon and Breslau leave Messina. In pursuance of the orders he had received from Germany, Admiral Souchon, with the Gerbon and Breslau, having at length completed coaling and made his will, steamed out of Messina harbour at 5 p.m. on the 6th of August, cleared for action and with his bands playing. He no doubt expected to encounter at least one and possibly two of the British battle cruisers as soon as he was outside territorial waters, in view of the fact that, as he was aware, his position must have been accurately known to the British Commander-in-Chief for many hours. This assumption was not unreasonable. Unhappily, as has been described, every one of the 3 British battle cruisers was otherwise engaged. Thus, when the German admiral rounded the southern point of Italy and turned eastward, the only 3 antagonists whose combination of firepower and speed he had to dread were already far astern. Still, there was the British armoured cruiser squadron watching the Adriatic. This squadron consisted of 4 good ships: Defence, Warrior, Duke of Edinburgh, and Black Prince. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Trowbridge, who had also under his orders 8 destroyers, and was being joined by the light cruiser Dublin and 2 more destroyers from Malta. It is necessary to restate the facts of this officer's actions. Rear Admiral Trowbridge's successive decisions. On the assumption, which was dominant, that the Gerbon would make for Polar, Admiral Trowbridge was well placed for meeting her. It was not until he heard from the Gloucester that she had turned south and was persistently steering on a southeasterly course that any new decision was required from him. He received no orders to quit his station from Sir Berkeley Milne. He was in constant hope of receiving a battle cruiser, but Admiral Trowbridge decided to act on his own responsibility. 8 minutes after midnight on the 6th of August, he gave orders to his 4 cruisers and his 8 destroyers to steam southward at full speed for the purpose of intercepting the Gerbon. He also signalled to the Dublin, at that moment coming from Malta, to join him with the 2 extra destroyers to head her off. He reported his decision to the Commander-in-Chief. Thus at midnight, 16 British vessels were converging upon the Gerbon and Breslau, and were in positions from which they could hardly fail to intercept the enemy shortly after daybreak. At 3:50 a.m, however, after further reflection, and having received no orders or reply from Sir Berkeley Milne, Admiral Trowbridge became convinced that he could not hope to engage the Gerbon under the advantageous conditions of the half-light of dawn, and that in an action fought in broad waters in full daylight, his 4 ships would be sunk one after another by the Gerbon, who all the time would keep outside the range, 16,000 yards, of the British 9.2-inch guns. This is thought by some naval officers to be an extreme view. The limited ammunition of the Gerbon would have had to have been wonderfully employed to have sunk all 4 British armoured cruisers at this long range. Moreover, if the Gerbon and Breslau had become involved in an action, it is hard to believe that none of the 16 British cruisers and destroyers which were available could have closed in upon them and attacked them with gun or torpedo. All the destroyers were capable of reaching the enemy and could have found the opportunity to attack. It would have been, indeed, a prodigious feat on the part of the Germans to dispose of so many antagonists at once. However, the Admiral came to the conclusion that the Gerbon was a superior force, which by his instructions, passed to him by the Commander-in-Chief, he was not to engage, and in this conclusion he has been sustained by a British naval court-martial. He therefore desisted from his attempt to intercept the Gerbon, turned his ships and destroyers, and entered the harbour of Zante about 10 a.m, preparing to resume his watch in the Adriatic. The Dublin and her 2 destroyers, having been refused permission to make a daylight attack, had attempted to intercept the Gerbon before dawn, but did not succeed in finding her in the darkness. Second escape of Gerbon. By 6 o'clock, therefore, on the morning of the 7th of August, the Gerbon, already the fastest capital ship in the Mediterranean, was steaming on an unobstructed course for the Dardanelles, carrying with her for the peoples of the East and Middle East more slaughter, more misery, and more ruin than has ever before been borne within the compass of a ship. Thus, of all the British vessels which were or could have been brought within effective distance, none did anything useful, excepting only the 2 light cruisers, Dublin and Gloucester, commanding as it happened by 2 brothers. The Dublin, as we have seen, did all in her power to place herself and her 2 destroyers athwart the enemy's course, and to fight him by night or day, and the Gloucester hung on to the heels of the Gerbon till late in the afternoon, in extreme danger and with the utmost tenacity, and only relinquished the chase under the direct orders of the Commander-in-Chief. In all this story of the escape of the Gerbon, one seems to see the influence of that sinister fatality which at a later stage, and on a far larger scale, was to dog the enterprise against the Dardanelles. The terrible ifs accumulate. In my first thoughts on July the 27th of sending the New Zealand to the Mediterranean had materialised. If we could have opened fire on the Gerbon during the afternoon of the 4th of August, if we had been less solicitous for Italian neutrality, if Sir Berkeley Milne had sent the Indomitable to coal at Malta instead of Bizerta, if the Admiralty had sent him direct instructions when on the night of the 5th they learned where the Gerbon was, if Rear Admiral Trowbridge in the small hours of the 7th of August had not changed his mind, if the Dublin and her 2 destroyers had intercepted the enemy during the night of the 6th and 7th, the story of the Gerbon would have ended here. There was, however, as it turned out, one more chance of annulling the doom of which she was the bearer. That chance, remote though it was, the fates were vigilant to destroy. Abandonment of the pursuit. At 1 a.m. on the 8th of August, Sir Berkeley Milne, having collected and coaled his 3 battle cruisers at Malta, set out at a moderate speed on an easterly course in pursuit of the Gerbon. At this juncture, the fates moved a blameless and punctilious Admiralty clerk to declare war upon Austria. The code telegram ordering hostilities to be commenced against Austria was inadvertently released without any authority whatsoever. The mistake was repaired a few hours later, but the first message reached Sir Berkeley Milne at 2 p.m. on the 8th of August, when he was halfway between Sicily and Greece. His original war orders had prescribed that in the event of a war with Austria, he should in the first instance concentrate his fleet near Malta, and faithful to these instructions, he turned his ships about and desisted from the pursuit of the Gerbon. 24 hours were thus lost before orders could reach him to resume it. But the Gerbon herself had come to a standstill. Admiral Suchet was cruising irresolutely about the Greek islands, endeavouring to make sure that he would be admitted by the Turks to the Dardanelles. He dallied 36 hours at Denusa, and was forced to use his telltale wireless on several occasions. It was not till the evening of the 10th that he entered the Dardanelles, and the curse descended irrevocably upon Turkey and the East. Transportation of the British Army to France. From the 9th to the 22nd of August, the army was crossing the Channel. This was a period of great anxiety to us. All the most fateful possibilities were open. We were bound to expect a military descent upon our coasts, with the intention of arresting or recalling our army, or a naval raid into the Channel to cut down the transports, or a concentrated submarine attack upon these vessels crowded with our troops. The great naval battle might begin at any moment, either independently or in connection with any of these operations. It was a period of extreme psychological tension. The naval dispositions by which the passage of the army was covered have been fully described in the official history of the war and in other service works. The northern approaches to the Straits of Dover were patrolled by cruiser squadrons and by flotillas from Harwich and the Thames. The Straits of Dover were minutely watched by the British and French destroyer flotillas of Commodore Keyes. Behind these, there was constituted on the 7th of August the Channel Fleet, comprising 19 battleships, of the 5th, 7th and 8th Battle Squadrons, now all fully mobilised. This fleet, having assembled under the command of Admiral Burney at Portland, cruised in readiness for the battle at the western end of the Channel, at such distances from the Dover cordon as its commander might judge convenient. The western entrance to the Channel was guarded by other cruiser squadrons. During the first few days of the transportation, no great numbers of troops were crossing the Channel, but from the 12th to the 16th, the bulk of the army was in transit, and the strategic tension reached its climax. Until this period was reached, the Grand Fleet was kept in its northern station, and was even permitted to cruise northwards of the Orkneys. But on the 12th of August, Admiral Jellicoe was directed to re-enter the North Sea and to cruise southward into a position of effective proximity. During the 3 days of heaviest transportation, August the 15th, 16th and 17th, the Heligoland Bight was closely blockaded by submarines and destroyers, supported between the Horn Reef and Dogger Bank by the whole of the Grand Fleet. Thus battle in open water was offered to the German Navy during the 3 days when their inducements to fight were at their maximum. But except for an occasional submarine, no sign betrayed the existence of the enemy's naval power. All went well. Not a ship was sunk. Not a man was drowned. All arrangements worked with the utmost smoothness and punctuality. The army's concentration was completed 3 days in advance of Sir John French's original undertaking to General Lanrezac, and with such secrecy was the whole of this vast operation enshrouded, that on the evening of the August the 21st, only a few hours before the British cavalry patrols were in contact with the Germans, General von Kluck, commanding the 1st German Army in Belgium, received from the Supreme Command no better information than the following. A landing of British troops at Boulogne and their advance from about Lille must be reckoned with. It is to be believed that no landing of British troops on a big scale has yet taken place. 3 days later, the whole British Army was fighting at Mons. If you missed the very first chapter of The Great War by Winston S. Churchill, click here. As always, thanks for watching.